Hallo allemaal, welkom bij XC-vlog Extra. Ik heb CMS-expert Tony White van Ars Logica gevraagd om in een online presentatie ons te inspireren wat volgens hem de succesfactoren van een goede CMS-implementatie zijn. Aan het einde stel ik hem ook een paar vragen. Als je meer wil weten, ga naar gsoftware.com en vraag het me.
Thank you, Francois, and thank you everyone for joining us on this webinar. I've entitled my portion, Implementing the Digital World. Specifically, this is about avoiding failure in your web experience management implementation. I'm Tony White, founder of Ars Logica. Just a little bit about me. This is my 20th year covering this space. I started in the late 90s working for Giga Information Group, which was founded by Gideon Gartner after he left Gartner Group. I've since worked for a number of technology vendors and other analyst firms. In 2006, I founded Ars Logica, and we've been focused on content management, content technologies, web experience management, and related technologies such as digital experience management. So with that, I'm going to delve into the substance of the presentation today. Let's think a minute about what defining yourself digitally means and what's at stake. So everybody, I think, knows the importance of digital experience management, of the quality of your brand, the ways in which you communicate your corporate vision and value to your customers. Web experience management really gives your company the opportunity to engage in a foundational process to change the way your customers perceive you in the marketplace. It's a way to go from what essentially some companies have now, brochureware, to truly engaging your customers. Let's think a little bit about what the dangers are when companies are not fully aware of the complexity of implementing such a digitally transformed web presence. And at this point, I'm going to start talking about examples from our consulting engagements. In particular, I'm going to talk about the failures because really what I want to focus on is telling you how to avoid the failures. That's the real subject of this webinar. So the process is a very complex one of implementing. It's not only implementing that's complex, it's actually performing the technology selection, knowing who should be on the team, what the budget should be, what the timeline should be, what the pitfalls are that so many other companies have fallen into. There's so many moving parts that without the benefit of other people who've already experienced this firsthand, it's almost impossible to understand how to use your time and resources to complete this process on budget and on time. I've seen it time and time again, companies spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and sometimes more on technologies that really weren't the best fit for them, or sometimes technologies that were the best fit for them, but then they had a realization that they didn't know how to make the technology operational. In other words, they didn't have the IT expertise to implement the technology. One of our clients asked after they had purchased, frankly, the most expensive web experience management platform on the market. He said, we've seen the best web platforms on the market. We've evaluated them. We bought what we believe to be the best fit. We also understand the digital marketing goals we would like the platform to help us achieve. But when it comes to actually implementing the product, there's so much we don't know that we hardly know where to begin. It feels to us as though there's a big gap between purchasing the best web technology and actually getting it working. We don't know if we will be able to fill the gap. And this is a recurring theme in consulting engagements. And there are a number of reasons why companies fall into this trap. And we'll talk about some of them in the following slides. Getting the right technology working on this subject, I'd say that the leading cause of delayed, stalled, or failed web implementations really isn't the technology selection component. It's the lack of understanding what's required to make that work. In one instance, clients dispute between marketing and IT, in which the marketing department prevailed, resulted in a 2.5-year implementation delay. After they selected what wasn't the best fit for them, but which was the most expensive product on the market, they spent $437 on licenses. And when I say it was the most expensive platform on the market, this is a small fraction of what they could have bought in the platform, but $437,000 was a significant sum to them. They soon realized after starting the implementation, or trying to start the implementation rather, that they didn't have the expertise in IT to actually do it. So what did they do? They went out and hired a number of consulting companies who specialized in information architectural planning and product training and so on. They spent about $125,000 on that kind of training. And after all of that, so after spending essentially $560,000 just in hard costs, we estimate that they spent another $350,000 on the staffing required in terms of time. So it was somewhere around $1 million that they spent on trying to get this wrong technology fit up and running. What they actually did was they selected a different DX platform, which was a much better fit, and proceeded smoothly through a proof of concept. And I'd like to add a little bit of context to this. This may come up in the Q&A as well. So the obvious question is, why did they select the wrong technology? A little history on the project. The project took about 3 to 4 months. And having done many of these projects before, I knew within about 3 to 4 weeks what the top recommendation was going to be. I could see their ways of working, the way the company had always interacted between IT and marketing. I could see the skill sets. I watched people do their work and understood what those processes were. And so much of the rest of the project, in my view, was going to be pretty much client education, bringing them up to speed on why I knew that my top recommendation was going to be a good fit. So after we got through that educational process, they actually agreed with me that this particular platform was the best fit. But then over the course of the next couple of months, they became, I would say, seduced by the marketing expertise of another vendor in the marketplace. And eventually, marketing bought into the messaging and became sort of overly ambitious about what they wanted to achieve with the platform. At the same time, the communication between IT and marketing broke down. So what ended up happening was marketing wanted to buy something that would cover them in terms of their goals for the next 5 years or so, overly blown goals. And IT really wasn't involved in the decision making. So what was actually purchased was a platform that IT didn't have the skills to deal with. That's the reason why it was a mistake. And so post-purchase and post 2.5-year delay, the client actually went back to the platform that we had agreed would be the best fit after 3 to 4 weeks. And that's the one that they did the proof of concept with. So the moral of the story is, if you don't have the communication processes between marketing and IT working well, and you don't right size your goals for the platform, you may end up with this kind of long delay, huge expense, and failed implementation all at the same time. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what some of the key factors are in a successful implementation. I hope to shed some light on the problems that you may face in getting newly purchased technologies fully functional. I'm going to draw on data that I've collected on consulting engagements from a wide variety of companies. And the subjects that I'd like to cover are pretty much these 8: information architectural planning, budgets, staffing requirements, product education and training, marketing to IT transfer of information, learning curves, timelines, and service providers. One of the first stages companies need to go through when organizing or revamping their digital presence is to get an understanding of how the components of their web and digital properties will fit together. Sometimes this is by brand, sometimes this is by division of the company. Sometimes it's more at the level of content audits, getting metadata and taxonomies in place. But you really do need to understand what the flow and interaction from and between content is, how people will discover it, what the customer journeys will look like. The information architecture needs to roughly match the scenarios you have for your customer journeys. And it would really be worth your while, if you don't have an information architect on staff, to hire an information architectural consulting firm to help you get your content in order, content audit to clean up the content, to make sure that it's discoverable, that metadata is in place, that your content types are consistent, that there is a single source of truth, that a repository, if you don't have a single repository on top of which your content management platform and other enterprise applications sit, you need to have virtualized layers so that the content is always consistent. Addressing the subject of budgets, this, of course, varies quite a bit from customer to customer. But there is a range, I would say, that you probably don't want to fall below. There really almost is no maximum range because implementations can be extraordinarily large sometimes. But just to give you an idea of the range of costs of digital experience platforms, web experience management technology, on the very low end of the spectrum, if let's say that you're a mid-sized company, let's say that you have somewhere between 500 and 1,500 employees, and you're in the middle of the spectrum when it comes to your marketing goals for a digital experience platform. On the very low end of the spectrum, in terms of licensing cost, I would say $100,000 US would be something that you can't get much below, if at all. I would say a more reasonable number would be somewhere in the $150,000 to $250,000 range, and that's a starting point. And that will be a rather arbitrary statement depending on who you are as a customer, but you should have something in that ballpark at least for licenses. And then in terms of implementation, roughly speaking, 2 to 3 times what you spend on the license is a typical cost for implementing a technology. Variations on this occur when your IT department is very skilled and wants to do a lot of the development in-house. You may have unique digital experience platform requirements that necessitate you developing a lot of of what appears to your customers, in which case you may be able to save some on the licensing budget, but you will usually more than make up for that in terms of staffing costs. Staffing requirements vary considerably depending on which platform you choose. But typically speaking, in the scenario that I just described, the mid-sized company with, say, 500 to 1,500 employees, staffing on average, I would say you would need between 3 and 6 to 7 full-time staff to fully maintain, develop, and customize on an ongoing basis the digital experience platform. This can be as few as 1 or 2 in some cases, and it can be a lot higher if you're the type of company who does all of its business online and you have a very demanding, say, web and digital presence. This is an area that may be the most overlooked of all of these. It's product education and training. It's rather surprising sometimes the amount of effort companies will put into evaluating and selecting a digital experience platform and then neglect to train people properly. This refers not only to the business users, the marketers who are using the platform to represent the company online. It also applies to developers who, while they may be experts in the development standards at your company, Java, for example, they may not have the specific skills to implement and manage effectively the platform that you choose. And so it's essential to include a budget for product education and training from the very beginning, and to make sure that everybody who touches the platform gets training. Typically, a business user will need somewhere between 2 and 5 days of training, and it's a good idea for IT people to have a week or 2 of training on site, either at the vendor or at a service provider, one of the vendor's service partners. Talking about the transfer of information between marketing and IT, mentioned earlier an example of a customer essentially failing with its implementation, but because of a breakdown, partially failed because of a breakdown between marketing and IT. This happens for a number of reasons, but essentially a lot of companies center control of the selection process either within marketing or within IT. And when the budget originates from one of the two departments, a lot of times that department ends up with more of a say about what gets chosen. And it's tempting for that department to enforce its views on the other department without listening. Typically, the way that this works is that they'll think that they understand, and they may well understand the marketing goals of the company much better than IT. But they should never forget that IT is going to be essential in crafting the solution which allows the company to deliver those goals. So buying a technology, buying a platform that is more sophisticated in a marketing sense won't do you any good if IT doesn't have the skills to administer it. And on the flip side, a lot of times when a budget is centered within IT, companies are often tempted to do too much custom development work. Sometimes a lot of that feature functionality will already be in the platform, but the IT department has for years been used to doing its own development and will essentially bypass some of the major value propositions of a platform that were the very reasons the marketing department chose or wanted to go with a certain platform in the first place. So it's essential to have some kind of balance between these two organizations. Learning curves. This is something that's very difficult to explain in a consulting engagement to a client, simply because when somebody doesn't know something, it's difficult to tell them what it is they don't know on the spot. This takes time. So consulting engagements are very commonly at least 50% a process of a company who's trying to choose a content management or a digital experience management platform. It's a process of them coming up to speed on what's available in the marketplace, what are the differences between the platforms, what does it mean when one vendor says something and another vendor says the same thing, but the platforms don't look anything like each other. So what does the jargon mean? And this is a process of at least 3 months. So this is the learning curve of understanding what the market offers. There's also the learning curve of, once you understand that and choose the technology that's right for you, what's the learning curve on the technical end of the implementation? And that also takes time. So it's not to be frightened of knowing that there's a lot you don't know. But what does need to happen is that you need to put enough time in your timeline to allow the company to come up to speed on this. And that amount of time needs to be 3 to 6. You won't be there in 6 months. That's a good amount of time to put in the timeline. But just understand that this is a process. It's continually evolving, and you very likely won't be truly comfortable with the platform that you choose for something like 12 to 18 months. So just be comfortable with the discomfort. Make that commitment ahead of time. Timelines. Companies are particularly prone to take the word of vendors or service providers who are overly optimistic about how quickly a platform can be implemented. A lot of times quotes will be given, promises made based on implementing a very small chunk of a company's digital presence, and the timeline will be something like 3 months. Just be aware of what can actually be done in 3 months, and I would say press very hard for details about what the proper scope of such a quick implementation would be. It's very likely that it will not be your whole web presence or your whole digital presence. It will be some chunk. And so a more realistic timeline, once you have the information architectural planning done, the budgets, the staffing, the product education strategy, all of that mapped out, a more realistic timeline would be 6 to 12 months in most cases. Finally, a word on service providers. I believe that selection of a service provider needs to be done in conjunction with selection of a technology platform. And the reason for that is fairly obvious. It's that some service providers have a lot more expertise implementing particular platforms than others. So it may be the case that you already have a good working relationship with a service provider, and you end up taking the recommendation for a technology platform from that service provider. That may be a good choice. The service provider certainly has a bias. It's essential that you be aware of that bias and to do a full consideration of the other technologies on the market that might be potentially better fits, which may mean that you need to go with a different service provider. But if you're starting from a neutral playing field and you choose one platform, you really should listen to the vendor about which service provider might be the best for you, And then you should do some due diligence in really vetting and interviewing that service provider to make sure there's a good fit in terms of chemistry, in terms of geographical coverage, adequate staffing. If you decide that you need to scale up their presence in your implementation, can they handle that? And there are a lot of other factors as well, but I truly believe that the selection of a service provider should be done during the process of selecting a technology platform.
Tony had het ook over de samenstelling van het team. IT en marketing, 2 essentiële onderdelen. En ik wil hem eigenlijk ook vragen wie er nog meer onderdeel moet zijn van dat team. Tony, one of the things you mentioned in your presentation was that IT and marketing should be aligned and part of the team. Who else should be on the team?
Other than marketing and IT, it's very important to have a few other groups and individuals represented. First of all, there needs to be at least one member of the most senior management in the company. Without support from the highest levels, there's a likelihood that these selection projects or implementation projects will stall due to higher priorities. To give one quick example, one client had the selection of a content management platform as the number one priority at the time they started the project. They didn't have the right level of executive support. Over the course of the project, the prioritization changed, and the content management selection project at one point was as low as number 11. So it kind of stalled. I kept asking what was going on, and eventually I was shown the list and figured out very quickly that priorities number 1 through 6 depended upon number 11. This is the kind of thing that can happen if you don't have the right level of executive support. So that's the first consideration. Another consideration is that every constituency in the company that's going to be using the content platform, the digital experience platform, should be in some way represented on the team, simply because when people contribute their efforts to the selection, they are much more invested in using the product properly and so on. So user adoption rates and so on are much higher. And in addition to that, I would say include stakeholders whose tangential technology selection projects may at some point be integrated with yours. So CRM, ERP, portal, records management, document management, intranet, any of those types of initiatives within the companies. It's very good to have someone from those teams on the DX selection team.
Tony, one of our customers told me it's not only choosing the right software, it's also choosing the right company to have a partnership with, because it's probably going to be a long-term relationship. What are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that are that it's an extremely valid point, first of all. Second of all, it's one of the soft factors that can be very difficult to quantify. Just being totally frank about the importance of a relationship between a customer and a vendor, I think it's one of the most important factors that can be considered. But as an analyst, it's difficult to write about because it's so personal to a company. What kind of feeling, what kind of takeaway, what kind of confidence and trust do they have in a vendor that develops through the interactions with the vendor in the selection process? It's hard to put a number or score on that. But I can tell you this, it's at least as important as any of the other factors, because you can actually build almost anything on a lot of the digital experience platforms out there. In terms of the actual technology, I would say probably 30% of the implementation success comes by virtue of choosing one technology that's a good fit over another one that might be almost as good of a fit. 70% of it comes from the actual implementation. And this is where the relationship with the vendor can be crucial. The responsiveness of the vendor, the amount of, I would say, it's almost a vendor's way of being in the world, of interacting with clients. How proactive are they? How energetic are they? How much energy does the vendor dedicate to creative solutions to processes? How long does it take for a vendor to respond to a ticket? These are all soft. I call them soft. They're terribly important, but they have much more to do with a level of trust that develops as a byproduct of interactions with the vendor. But the chemistry is terribly important. So in a case where one technology might seem slightly better, but the other vendor seems a lot better, and I would go with option 2. Thank you, Francois and GX Software, for inviting me to this webinar. Feel free, anyone in the audience, to contact me by email, which is on the last slide of the presentation.